Our scripture for today is from Matthew 25, 1 through 13. And it is printed on the back of your bulletin if you would like to follow along. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look, here is the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise replied, "No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves." And while they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the other bridesmaids came also, saying, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour." This is God's good news for all of God's people.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Sean. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, we pray. Our God, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen. I have been blessed to work with the military for about 17 years or so in a previous life, and so I was not in the military myself. I was not. I didn't carry a weapon. I didn't go through the crucible that is basic training. I didn't go through all of those things, but I was lucky enough to be deployed a couple of times in areas that were interesting, and then work with some of the most amazing individuals that I have ever had the pleasure to meet. But one of the things that I learned, especially in a deployment to the Middle East, was this wisdom. That most military folks will tell you that being in the military is 90% boredom and 10% sheer terror. It's that moment that you train for, you plan for, you lay ready for, and then something happens, and you actually have to put that training and work into use. Now, some of the young guns will be real anxious to get at it and get to that moment, but some of the older, more seasoned, more professional soldiers and sailors that I've had the pleasure of knowing know that you hope that day will never come. You prepare. You prepare as best as you can, physically and emotionally, and yet you hope. We ask those individuals so much. In this Veterans Day weekend, we remember those that we have asked and those that have said yes. We remember those who have day in and day out been prepared to do, and many have done, things that you and I would never imagine. And it takes a toll. Sometimes those moments are measured by the lives that are lost. Quite frequently, those moments are measured by the lives that have been changed forever. Theologians have tried over the ages to understand how this fits within the gospel of grace and love, how this works. Actually, it predates Christian times. This moment of understanding how to understand what would possibly justify this moment of taking up arms. It has its ancient roots throughout cultures throughout the world. It comes up in a Hindu poem that predates Christianity by hundreds of years. It's found in ancient Egypt writings. It's found in Roman culture as well. And Christian theory comes to this moment through St. Aquinas of Hippo, in the late 4th and early 5th century or so. Aquinas came up with some principles of what he considers just war theory, and that's kind of what the shorthand is for this understanding, because Aquinas came to the understanding that when doing nothing in the presence of evil, that's sin. But when we do nothing, when we might possibly have saved the innocents, have stopped evil from happening, and doing nothing to Aquinas was a sin. But that there needed to be some guidelines, some rules, and I wanted to share them with you for just very briefly, so bear with me for just a moment. The first guideline that he suggests is that war needs to be engaged in only as an absolute last result. When all peaceful efforts have been exhausted, only then might war be necessary. It needs to be seen as an action of a legitimate authority, so he wasn't necessarily laying it out for individuals to take up arms against some government that they felt was wrong, but that this needs to be a moment between governing powers, that a legitimate authority needs to be engaged. The third thing is that it needs to be in response to some wrong that has been suffered. This isn't that moment when one country decides that they want the resources of another and they go to take them over. Wars of conquest did not fall under the category of just war that Aquinas was offering. There needs to be, in the fourth item, a probability of success. It can't be that impossible cause that would simply wind up expending lives that will be lost for no reason. The fifth thing is that there needs to be a right intention. That war is always fought to restore peace as a final goal. There needs to be proportionality, and I kind of struggled with this one to figure out what that might mean. That has its roots in that old Hindu poem that goes back years and years, I couldn't read you the Hindu anyway, but the poem referred to that moment when you would not put chariots against just infantry, that you would put chariots against chariots, that there needed to be some proportionality, and it's that moment when we understand that when we go to war, we don't go all out, we don't drag out the nukes and just level the place. We want to make sure that there's some proportionality, mainly because of this last item, is that innocent civilians are never the target. And that's what Aquinas considered as just war. Now, the reason I went through all of that stuff is to understand that as human beings, we don't go through this great length to try and understand or to figure out, or at least get it right with our hearts, unless we know that there is an incredible cost to this thing that we ask our servicemen and women to engage in. The cost is terribly high. And we better be sure that it is unavoidably necessary once we ask. And we have asked. We've asked our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines, our sons, our daughters, our wives, our husbands, our friends and neighbors. And they have risked their lives, trusting that someone up the food chain, up that chain of command, was making the right call. And so from Gettysburg in the Civil War to Gallipoli in World War I to Anzio in World War II to Afghanistan most recently. and thousands of nameless patches of worthless ground and anonymous ocean in between. In each and every one of those places, men and women have prepared as best as they possibly could. And some have seen no action at all. And some have seen more than their hearts can bear. So the question that I'd like to ask this morning is not whether they were prepared, they were. Are we? Are we ready when they come home? Are we prepared to welcome them, to honor their sacrifice, to walk with them as they encounter that jarring change from combat ready to coming home to a place that struggles to understand? Our scripture lesson this morning can go a whole lot of ways, and certainly there's lots of conversation, lots of commentary made about the 10 bridesmaids, that what they represent and who the bridegroom is, and yet the one takeaway that I'd like you to drill down to on this particular piece of scripture is just this: we're called as followers of Christ to be ready, to be prepared, and not too much of a spoiler alert, if you look at the 25th chapter of Matthew, this is the first part of that, and there's a piece in the middle that we'll be talking about next Sunday. 2 Sundays from now, Cindy Sadler will be standing here, and she'll be preaching about that last part of the 25th chapter of Matthew, where Jesus is talking about end times and separating the sheep from the goats. And the takeaway from that moment is that when we have cared for the least and the last and the lost among us, we have cared for that person as if they were Jesus. Are we ready to do that? This chapter, this piece that we have this morning that Shelley just read, asks us that question: are we ready? Are we prepared? Will we care for the broken, the outcast, the used up members of the family of God, as if we would care for Jesus himself? We can ask that question on this Veterans Day weekend. How are we doing? I sought out a few veterans over this past week or so just to ask that question, just very simply: how are we doing? What could we do? What are we doing well, and what have we done not so well at all? I was reminded of the horrible reception that Vietnam vets received when they came home. I was still pretty young, and quite frankly, I had just missed Vietnam by about a year. I missed the draft by 1 year. But those men and women that came home to horrible treatment. And I am delighted to say that things have changed. Most frequently now we will see signs of appreciation and honor for those that have come home. The Veterans Administration has had somewhat of a spotty relationship and performance as well, and the horror stories, as I got online and did some research and heard about the numbers of times when wait lists were so long that veterans would die while they were waiting to be seen by the Veterans Administration. Time and time again, I would read of times when our veterans who had finally gotten into care had been treated so badly that they had to be called back in for infections or things that they had caught while they were there. The most jarring moment that I caught was John Cochran Hospital just north of us in St. Louis. 1,800 individuals were exposed to infection while they were getting dental care. And I've listened to news reports just over the weekend because it's one of the things that the news reports have been covering this past time, is how the VA and how we in general have been caring for our veterans. And I was delighted when I had a conversation with Gary just this last week, who reported that his last trip to John Cochran, it was like a different place. And the Veterans Administration is taking great pains and working very, very hard to reduce the wait times and to make things cleaner and more responsive, and to provide the exceptional care that these men and women deserve. Other agencies that I found as I was doing some research on this, the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans is working on the almost intractable job of helping veterans who find themselves homeless. Thousands are being helped with job placement skills, legal aid, and other services. The Veterans History Project, that was an awesome moment that I identified. I stumbled across, quite frankly, this moment when veterans are being asked to tell their stories and record that moment and be heard. What a gift it is at that moment to finally have the journey that you have gone through that no one else, quite frankly, understands as well, and to be heard in that moment. There's another mental health program called Give an Hour, where volunteers come in and they help, and trained people will be there to help with mental health needs. The Disabled American Veterans, you may be familiar with already, offers outreach and advocacy, and there are more agencies like this that are coming together and helping those that have offered and given their service. To give those veterans a sense of home that sometimes feels more strange than any foreign country that they have served in. Nevertheless, there is more to do. This Veterans Day weekend, and quite frankly on every day, we're asked to be ready. And not just for veterans, we're asked to be ready for 1,000 different ways and 1,000 different moments. In this congregation alone, we need to be ready for those kids. Remember the backpacks that were right over here? We're over here during time. Because Jesus will come to us and he'll look like a child rescued from an abusive home. And we need to be ready through a backpack or a moment of hope. Those backpacks sent through the festival of sharing are our way to be ready in those circumstances. If Jesus comes to us looking like a hungry single mom, we need to be ready through the food pantry, stocked with what we can offer. And if Jesus comes to us looking like a veteran who struggles with PTSD, or homelessness, or unemployment, or even thoughts of suicide, all things that are much higher in number in the veteran population, we need to be ready. We need to be the church family who welcomes him or her into this place. We need to be the Christian who understands that that person needs the grace that you or I have found. We need to be the family that that individual needs. And if we can be with those lives who wander between the search, or wander between the boredom of the daily search for hope and the moments of absolutely sheer terror when they think that hope is lost, if we are ready, then we will be found ready to receive Christ. You see, God finds us where we are already living. Where and how we spend our days, not some moment when we make some act that's going to look good for the moment or the camera, but only when we are ready, day in and day out, to show a heart transformed by grace. Only then will we be ready to help those in need to find a home. Only then will we be ready to receive Christ. Let's bow our heads. Gracious and loving God, we will not know when that moment will come, but we know it will. Make us ready. Change our hearts. Soften those hearts, that we may be, for these that come, needing and hoping that they will find you in this place, in this home, We ask in your Son's name. Amen.